We're going to now move on to our final session of the morning, which is the forum panel discussion on the subject of food security. And I'm delighted to welcome, to moderate this discussion, business journalist and author Richard Dean. Thank you, Richard. If you'd like to take your seat. Richard has spent the past decade covering the Gulf Arab states and has written widely for blue-chip media such as the FT and The Economist. As a broadcaster, Richard launched and pioneered the award-winning Business Breakfast radio show in Dubai, which many of you might know, and currently presents Business Tonight on Dubai Eye. Also to join Richard, I'm delighted to welcome His Excellency Ya'qub Abu Omar, South African Ambassador to the UAE. If you'd like to make your way, Your Excellency, thank you. His Excellency Omar was a political activist from a young age and joined the ANC, was detained and escaped into exile in 1985. He later served in both Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki's governments, and then he went on to join the private sector. In 2003, he was appointed ambassador to Oman, and he took up his current role as ambassador to the UAE 2.5 years ago. We're also delighted to have joining the panel. I'd like to welcome Mr. Geoffrey Culpepper, chairman and founder of Agri Sakura. Geoffrey, if you'd like to make your way up. Thank you. Mr. Culpepper is also founder and chairman of Sakura Capital Partners, an advisory firm that helps clients make sustainable decisions on M&A activities. Before setting up Agri Sakura, Mr. Culpepper had an extensive career in banking in the Euro-MENA region. We're also joined on the panel by Dr. Deborah Schlichting, senior economist at Solvus Economics. Thank you. Dr. Schlichting has a PhD in agricultural economics, for which she specialized in food security. She's consulted to large donor organizations like the World Bank and has worked on projects across this MENA region. Solvus Economics specializes in research and analysis of food security issues, particularly in the GCC. And I'd like to also welcome again and invite Mr. Hamouda to join the panel on stage. And I will hand the discussion over to you, Richard. Thank you very much.
Diana, thank you very much indeed. Appreciate that. Listen, let's get straight into it. Interesting comment I picked up on from His Highness was the phrase pragmatic innovation, with an emphasis, I think, on pragmatic. So I'm going to begin by asking what our panelists are doing. What's their contribution? Which piece of the jigsaw are they helping to make? Your Excellency, if I can start with you, first of all, in South Africa. What is being done?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers, Gulf Intelligence, for this really interesting conference. I'm really pleased to be here. I think we've touched on some of the more global, sort of universal themes in the first session, and I think also from, I couldn't make it for last year's conference, but I understand you did deal a lot with some of the global sort of problems that we're having. And I think His Highness is hitting the nail on the head with saying that we actually need to bring it down more to reality. We need to get away from this wide, broad, sweeping generalizations of what will work, what won't work. There's been a couple of decades of experimenting on how we can go forward on the issue of securing food security, how we can avoid dire famine, hunger, poverty, and so forth. The range of options are wide. Some of the experiments and experiences have shown that some work better than the other. I think the starting point is that even for a lapsed socialist like me, one has to admit that you've got to have a market-driven approach, and I think that's what Sir Bob was also making. That whether you like Romany creams or lemon creams or fig rolls, you're going to have people that are going to get into the business to provide the kind of needs that people have expressed. But that obviously is meeting needs at an extremely different level. We're talking about people that are trying to meet very basic needs, of simply trying to avoid going to bed hungry, of not sure where next day's meal is going to be. Now, our approach has been several-fold in South Africa. One is obviously centered around what we call the land question. I think there's been a long history of the majority of the population not having access to the land. And the whole question of land redistribution is part and parcel of addressing the kind of famine, poverty, and hunger that we are experiencing in South Africa. Even for a middle income level country, as defined by the IMF, we do have huge patches of poverty and hunger. The second area is to look at welfare innovations and how we can intervene in that. But I think the third area, and this is what I want to touch on, especially since we're speaking in the region, in the Gulf, is to look at a win-win situation for countries that are in the Gulf and those countries that are in Africa. And I think a lot of the material that's been writing has been drawing parallels, for example, around the debates around oil dependency and oil independence. And I think it lends itself to food dependency and food security and food independence very well. In the Gulf, there is a deprivation of food. We cannot grow food well enough or cheaply enough in the land that we have here. Too much of desert, the water is very expensive. And then in parts of Africa, we have got land that is arable, that we do have lots more water in comparatively. Now we need to find a way that we overcome that. Trying to grow all that food in the Gulf is almost impossible. It has been tried, it is expensive. At one point, Saudi Arabia became the 6th or 7th world largest wheat producer, but at a huge cost. I know that a number of countries are trying to look at big agricultural projects and so forth, but we need to look at the costs that are incurred in terms of trying to get the water that is not there, and they're trying to make the land available for that. So my suggestion, just to round off, I don't dominate the whole opening session, is to say that we need to look at greater collaboration at a global level that finds solutions at a local level. Buying land in a speculative way is not going to be the way to go ahead, but we need to find collaboration in agribusinesses that meet the needs of the local population, as well able to create enough food to be able to export it to where it's required. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So even a lapsed socialist accepts that we need a market-driven approach, which I guess brings us neatly onto our former investment banker. Jeffrey, what are you doing at AgriSecura to help this problem?
Thank you. I guess I've always classified myself as a compassionate capitalist, that it is it's extremely important for people who are fortunate to have been able to benefit from education, society, culture, proximity of birth, that when you have those genuine blessings, you need to use that information, that currency, that resources you have to be able to share with others, to give them the opportunities that you've been blessed with. I guess, one of the things that I've come to realize after all these years of, working in Africa and Caribbean and the Middle East is that I agree with Sir Bob. The train is going to wreck. If you just look at the numbers, cold light of day, there's going to be too many mouths to feed. There's too many people that require it, and the food is in places where the populations aren't. Classic examples, if you think about it, there's only 5 food exporting countries in the world: the US, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and Australia. 4 of those 5 are in the same zone. Australia is currently a major food exporter, but you have 1 year of droughts or 1 year of floods, and that dramatically affects what happens in China because largest market. This summer, I was traveling around the midsection of the U.S. in Pennsylvania on my motorbike, as I do every summer, and I was stopping and talking to a bunch of Amish farmers who were at a little dining room, diner type thing. And I always find it fascinating because usually in times of high production of corn, which that part of Pennsylvania is famous for, these guys are generally very depressed because the more they produce, prices go down. And this year they seemed relatively happy. I said, well, what's different this year from years in the past? They said, well, because China is buying every bushel of corn we can produce. And so for the first time in decades, overproduction is being rewarded as opposed to being punished with low prices. And what was driving that is the Chinese government policy that by 2015 they're going to be self-sufficient in pork, which is the largest source of protein in China. And the government has publicly said we're going to do that, we're making the investments, and we're going to just rapidly increase Chinese pork available so we're less dependent on buying pork from other markets. What they don't talk about is the inability of them to produce enough feed for that rapid increase in pork production. So yes, you are gaining the political will of the people by saying we have more pork available grown locally, but what you're not saying is the dependence we have of going abroad and buying the corn necessary to do that. So where is the right balance? You know, do you import the food or do you import the food byproduct? But at the end of the day, China has made a very clear decision many years ago to be an industrialized nation. They have prospered dramatically, probably more than any country in our lifetime. But the cost of that has been now they are food dependent. The issues that I was recently in Beijing and I was meeting some government officials, and I said, you know, what keeps you guys awake at night? Nuclear war, the Russians, the Americans, the price of the dollar, what kind of issues of oil, natural resources. He says, no, what keeps us awake at night is that will we have enough food in the stores on any given day so that when the factory workers take their hard-earned currency from all their production and they want to go out and buy food, that it's there at an affordable price. He said it's not about Mercedes, it's not about Panasonic TVs, it's not about the latest golf clubs. It's the basic need to be able to go to the supermarket and purchase food because you are no longer living on the land. You can take a farmer and turn him into a factory worker. You cannot take a factory worker and turn him into a farmer. So China, up until about 7 years ago, was fairly self-sufficient. Now they are completely dependent on other people to feed them and to feed that industrial might. That imbalance is dangerous. Now, what we're looking at in AgriSecura, and this is something we've been working on a long time, and I was able to do it part-time, when I was in banking, now I can do it full-time, is figuring out the train is going to wreck. There is going to be a major shift in the world's population because there's just not enough food being produced, and the food is all in the wrong places for the large urbanized economies. The dynamic now is east-west. The dynamic is going to be Brazil, Middle East, Asia. I think less and less is going to be important north-south. I mean, South Africa is a classic example. If you look where all the growth in trade in South Africa now is business with other African countries. It's not business in Europe. It's business in Southeast Asia. It's business in Latin America. And trading of resources and the trading of opportunities there. It's less and less going to be a north-south dynamic. Now, the dangerous bit is that all the nasty weapons of the world happen to be in the north. Right? If you think of all of the vast quantity of nuclear weapons, you think of all the vast investments in technology that can produce things like dirty bombs and things like biological warfare and technological warfare, that power rests within the northern hemisphere. But the people who are going to have a direct effect on is going to be in the southern hemisphere. But the guys in the south have the food. And that food is a very powerful weapon. And what we're doing is working in places such as Africa with excellent companies like African Century or Tilda Rice, is saying, hey, as opposed to doing everything you can do to get off the farm and go into the city, whether it be Nairobi or Johannesburg or Dar es Salaam or whatnot, stay on the farm. We will provide you with the education that you need to be a better farmer. We will provide you with the technology you need for water conservation, to decrease chemical dependency, to help in better marketing. That cell phone you have in your pocket, it's more powerful than just to talk to your girlfriend across the village. You can use that to access tremendous amounts of data to decide on what do I grow, where do I sell it, and how do I get here. Working on infrastructure, not necessarily a new power plant to feed electricity into the growing suburbs of Nairobi, but use that technology to be able to figure out how can I produce electricity by using biomass. You create a lot of green waste in farming activities, turn that into something that's very, very powerful, which is electricity. And then if you do it well, you can export that. So, traditionally we've taught our children, get an education, be a lawyer, be a doctor, be a journalist, be a banker, be an engineer, be something white collar where you can go off and work in a big building in an office and do jobs that keep clean hands. Get off the farm. I grew up on a farm, and I could not have run fast enough at the age 18 to leave, because the last thing I ever want to do to be farming, so it's ironic. I'm now an investor in agriculture. But it's taken me about 40 years to make that transition. So tell the people that being a farmer is powerful, because at the end of the day, you will you will control a resource that these other people desperately need. Being a farmer is prosperous. You know, you can make money being a farmer. You can be prosperous. You can build your family. You can educate your children. But, you know, staying on the land and using that land as a trustee and good husbandry is long-term going to have a lot more power than moving off into the city and competing for scarce resources.
I read an interesting blog on, I think it was the Huffington Post just a couple of days ago, a guy called Richard Attias, who launched something called the Global Food Security Program in Morocco last week. Did anyone see that, the Global Food Security Program? It's an initiative, much as its name suggests. And he said, this is a great phrase, and it echoes what you're saying, we've got to make farming sexy. It's got to be a career of choice for people. And then people will go into farming, echoing your point. Deborah, if I can turn to you, you spend a lot of time in academia researching these issues, and now with Solvus, you spend a lot of time in practice working on projects, doing feasibility studies. What has that experience, both theoretical, if you like, and practical, what are the big lessons you've taken away from that?
At the moment, I'm focusing my work largely on the GCC, in particular in Abu Dhabi. The food security problem here is a little different from what we see in the poor countries. Normally, food security, you think about poor people who are hungry and they're wondering where their next meal is coming from. Here in the GCC, food security is it's couched slightly different in that it comes, like what Jeff was saying, it comes down to being food import dependent. And so you are, because you can't grow your food here, you are dependent on importing all of your food. It's a very high. It's around high 80%. It's around 90% is imported here. This exposes you to certain vulnerabilities, whether these are economic vulnerabilities, price shocks, trade disruptions. The neighbours are currently talking about closing the Strait of Hormuz. This would have a significant impact on food shipments for us here. So what I'm looking at the moment, and when you ask about the feasibility studies, is domestic production. And even here today, I've heard people turn their nose up at the idea of domestic food production here in the arid countries. It can be done, and it is being done. There is some, and it's small scale. I'm not at all suggesting that there could ever be complete import substitution, that this could be achievable, full reliance on domestic production. But the private sector here in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, is currently investing in some very interesting technology, not all of it new technology, to produce food through hydroponics and aquaculture. And the role of these types of currently small-scale food production exercises, I think, will become increasingly important in this country here and all around the world, because it also allows you to localize your food production. And so you're saying earlier that we have food being produced in areas where there are no people. You can have an aquaponics plant. Aquaponics is a combination of aquaculture and hydroponics, so fish and salad heads, for example, is in Mafraq. It's just up the road. And there's a hydroponic farming enterprise here. They will deliver to your door, locally grown in Abu Dhabi, sustainable water use, and prices that are comparable to what you would pay at Carrefour or Lulu. And this is, it's sustainable. It's water sustainable. It's not profligate in its water usage. There are still, as we were talking earlier, some very inefficient farming methods being used all around the world. And here we have technology and enterprises that are appropriate for domestic production. So this, from a very local perspective, is what I'm looking at the moment. And I think there's a good future in it here. And bringing in technical expertise from all around the world to do the work here.
Ashraf, I'll come to you in a second. Just very quickly, Deborah, last night, Sean Evers and I were on the radio talking with a couple of guys who are launching a company today in Dubai called AgriCell, which, much like you say, is going to, they call it farm in a box or farming through film, and it's basically like a pamper. The kind of gel you get in a child's pamper, and they infuse that with nitrates, and they grow tomatoes out of it, and they're doing it in Japan, and they say you can do it quite happily in Sharjah or Al Ain or whatever, just in 30 seconds. Then we were quite skeptical, and all our listeners sending in text messages were going, this sounds too good to be true, this is just, science fiction. this can never work. But broadly speaking, you seem to be suggesting that that kind of technology can work.
Yes, yes, it can. Anybody who has, I don't know about this, I think it sounds like a water cell, solid cell type thing, but anybody who's lived in a university town will know that hydroponics has been used by students for many years.
Ashraf, if I can turn to you. Let's change the direction of the discussion. I'm particularly interested in your job title and the words partnerships and business development, because that's what you focus on, isn't it? It's not, when we think of the UN, we think of the World Food Programme, of course we think of the videos we see on CNN and food being dropped out of helicopters and aeroplanes, which is a good and wonderful thing. But that's not what you do, is it? You do something very different.
Well, we are in a unique position as WFP, is that we are in the field, but at the same time, we live off donations. I mean, that's practically 100% of our money is off donations. However, as the world progresses, governments are unable to do enough. So what we need to do is we build relationships with the private sector. And based on these relationships and based on this partnership...
Ashraf, if I can ask you to hold the microphone a bit like an ice cream cone.
Okay.
Thanks.
So we build on those relationships. And on those relationships help us to move forward on how to bring technological advances or even distribution. So I'll cite an example with PepsiCo, for example. They give us about $6-7 million a year, and they help us in projects in Ethiopia, innovating products, building factories and putting back. They help in our school feeding programs, which youth is very important. We feed about 22 million kids a year, and education for us is vitally important. So we need support from the private sector, and we need to be able to build partnerships. And in that way, I can use the word sexy, because when you talk about food security and you go to a company like an oil company, where does it fit? But believe it or not, we were able to convince somebody like Art Dubai to be our partner for food security for next year. So how can you bring art into food security? But it's simple. It's really developing those sexy concepts and make it exciting to the partners. We go under CSR, but believe it or not, people think CSR is a philanthropic idealism. It's not. CSR is a business concept, and how to make things both profitable for the partner, as well as engaging with the consumers or the clients, as well as to serve the people that we need to do.
I'm going to throw this open to questions straight away. We've got about, I guess, sort of 20, 25 minutes or so for questions now. I'm keen to take as many as possible. So if you're asking a question, we've got microphones. They'll come to you. It'd be great if you could introduce yourself. I was going to ask who's got the first question, but the hands are already up. Yes, sir. First question to you. A microphone is on its way.
I'm Mohammed Diab. I'm from World Food Programme. My question really relates to food security, and especially food security in GCC countries. We have heard very interesting discussion now, and there is a lot to be done in areas of food security, including the message which we received by TV from Lebanon, from the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister. So the issue is how do really we work out a solution between a food security which results from food production and food self-sufficiency in the country, and food security which is from improving your import capacity to import food from abroad, and food security resulting from investing abroad for investment, especially in the food sector, where you bring the proceeds back to the own country. There is a trend recently of investing in other countries, and which is very good, and as His Excellency the Ambassador said, if it works as a win-win situation, that really solves the problem of food security or insecurity, whether it is in the Gulf or in food-producing countries. Let us take Africa, for example. However, the previous experience or some of the experiences indicate that there is no much participation of those who have been affected by land acquisition, and at times it results in eviction of population from the areas to different areas where they are not very much involved. Even at times, some of them even lose their coping strategy even to meet their basic needs. So I think the win-win situation, if I may add, requires really participatory approach at the other end, where people who are going to be affected are involved in the decision, and not only that one, are part and parcel of the production in that area. I mean, supporting the community, employing youths and employing people in the rural areas, and also giving more and more opportunity for the rural areas to be part of this. Unfortunately,
I'm going to throw the question to the panel now. So thank you very much indeed, sir. Your Excellency, if I can throw that to you, this idea that it's portrayed as a win-win situation, which in many ways it is, but it can be an opportunistic land grab if it's not done well. What's been your experience in South Africa, but more broadly on the continent?
Yeah, I think I'll have to speak more broadly because there's obviously differences in different African countries, different experiences, and also from the GCC there have been different approaches as well taken. I think we've had in some cases where companies or governments have been buying up land, but the level of that purchase of the land actually getting into an agri-project is very low. So, sometimes we've wondered, whether it is just for land speculation purposes or not. But I agree with Mohammed that I think the point you're making is that there has to be quite a participatory process because, there's a number of issues when you buy a land. And we had one particular experience where a UAE company did have access to a very large piece of land. And there was all kinds of problems that they encountered. But one of the biggest ones, which they hadn't even thought about, was simply the issue of ancestral rights to that land. A whole lot of tribal groupings had been settled there for ages, and they had buried their dead for a long time and that kind of thing. And the land that they had been given was smack in the middle of that. So, local knowledge is very important, one. Two is that just having ownership of that land isn't the answer. Because, already there are other pastoralists, other people that have been buying there. Also, you're not sure the extent of overuse and to what extent has the land already been degraded and abused and so forth. So I think what we're finding is there are a lot of smarter approaches that are emerging. And I think FT did a good story a couple of years ago about ADS spearheading the UAE strategy around commodities. And I think some people are unhappy with the fact that commodities have been seen as one of the many asset classes. And as a result, you find the kind of lots of factors, but part of that factor is contributing towards food inflation as well in terms of in areas like cereals and pulses and so forth. So what we need to do is look at a process whereby people actually consider a number of these factors in looking at if they want to get involved in a project in that country. Furthermore, I think a number of governments are beginning to push back. They're passing law that's making it difficult for foreign ownership of land. In Thailand, Brazil, for example, a very clear example. You're not going to get very easily foreign ownership of agricultural land. Some are specific about agricultural land as well. South Africa hasn't gone to that extreme. I think we're still fairly open. But what we're finding is a slightly perverse kind of development occurring as well. As someone told me that after someone has bought a football club, the next best thing is to have their own private game reserve. And I think that's what's happening, that prime land is now being bought up for very private purposes as well. So I think there's a number of issues that we need to look at. I'm just throwing these out. There's no particularly neat solutions to them.
Jeffrey, you're investing not necessarily in land as such, but you are investing in organizations that need land. They're agricultural organizations. How do you wrestle with these ethical dilemmas on a day-to-day basis? You need to make money, you've got to make a return for your investors, but you've got to be ethical.
Sure. Yeah. By policy, we do not invest in land. I personally and philosophically am against that. Yeah, land needs to stay in the ownership of the people who are working it, and that's the farmers on it. We have seen in the past abuses that His Excellency mentioned, places like Sudan, Ethiopia, Congo, where private individuals literally would buy up hundreds of thousands of hectares of land to become their private estate. They may farm it, they may not. And to this day, I can think of maybe a half a dozen major land purchases over the last 10 years, and not one of those parcels is in production of food. They're just there as a land bank, they're a safety net, we will keep it there in case we eat later. To me, that's wrong. You know, it's morally apprehensible. It's, you know, if you have land, you should be employing the farmers to work that land, not as their landlord, but as their partner, as their investor. At AgriSecure, we only invest in companies that are operating it. We do never take ownership of land. We keep talking about the issue of food security in the GCC. I think something we need to realize is there will never, ever be food security here in the GCC. The physics are all wrong. This is a desert country that 35 years ago had a very small population that was self-sustaining through local agriculture methods, you know, eating fish from the sea. But because of the prosperity brought along by hydrocarbons, yet this place has exploded into a wonderful physical but very unsustainable society. But as long as there is a need in the industrialized world for hydrocarbons, they will be able to continue to purchase the necessary level to keep the food anxiety down. But there'll never be food security here because there's no water. You know, at the end of the day, water is a very precious commodity. It gets manufactured.
Can I reply to your point?
Sure.
Let's define food security. So food security is not just producing your own food. So that you're talking, I think, about food self-sufficiency. I agree. The GCC countries cannot achieve self-sufficiency, but they can achieve food security through a balance of a small amount of domestic production and beneficial trade. And that trade can happen through bilateral agreements. You go directly to your producer and you want to go buy rice from the Thais. You can go straight to the farm, or you can go to international markets and buy that. Going to the international markets comes with some risk exposure. Part of the strategy can also be to buy farms and buy land, and this is the bit we're talking about here. But I would have to say that the GCC countries, through a balance of domestic production, bilateral agreements, production agreements, they can achieve food security to meet their needs.
There was a question over here to my far left. Lady with the red. Yes, please. If you could introduce yourself, please, and then give us your question.
Hi, I'm Camilla Hall from the Financial Times here in Abu Dhabi. I guess this is directed at Dr. Deborah. I mean, what in your mind is the kind of ideal balance for somewhere like the UAE in terms of domestic production and import? As you said, it will be impossible to be totally reliant on domestic production, but what's the balance? And just a second question to the panel. I was very interested in your comments about the usage of land that is bought in Africa and particularly by GCC investors. Is that really a trend that this land is not being worked once it's bought? Is it just sitting there and actually at the time of need those crops won't be ready for them to rely on at that stage? I'd really like to talk about that as well if the panel wouldn't mind answering that. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll come to that second question, but first of all, Deborah, the specific question to you.
So let's look at the UAE. I think if you take some of these, they're nascent, not nascent technologies, but nascent application of some of these technologies. The UAE could achieve a reasonable proportion of domestic production for things like green leafy vegetables, spinach, for example, some vegetables like capsicum, not rice, not wheat, not these large ones. I think aquaculture, fish farming, could make a reasonably good contribution. And this would also take the stress away from overfishing stocks like hamur, which is already under stress. So I do believe it will always be a relatively small proportion that will come from domestic production. The rest will have to come from purchases. And you either buy these, like I said, off the international market and you bid. However, the UAE on the global scale is still a small country, and so it's a small hitter when it comes to bidding on the international market. And so it is effectively a price taker. It doesn't really have the clout to sway world prices. Okay, a single big purchase of wheat by the UAE isn't going to shake the market. So the UAE might look more to buying directly off some of its friend countries. They could buy rice directly from Thailand or Vietnam. And this would then rely on bilateral relations. And the UAE has very good, friendly bilateral relations with many countries.
Thank you very much. On the second question, Ashraf, if I can turn to you.
Yes, please. Definitely there are inefficiencies in Africa, especially with regards to farming. We realized that, and we also thought that a lot of the food that we're putting back in, you really need to move away from food aid to food assistance. So we created a pilot project called Purchase for Progress, P4P. And it's proven quite a success, and it's actually an interaction with the farmer, training him, providing him with the seeds, providing with the training on how to get the market forces in place, how to sell his product. We actually buy from them, and we distribute around. It started out as a pilot project in about 21 countries. Now it's a $1 million project with the governments, with the aid of the government, because one of the things that His Excellency, the ambassador of Uganda, was mentioning, this is what we need to do. We need to be able to teach them not just about farming, but how to use the whole market scales by bringing in the traders, by bringing in the market forces in place. This would definitely replace a part of what we call land grab, because in this case it would be able to help them out. We bring in private sector companies, we bring in governments, we bring in other UN agencies to be able to achieve that. It's not a one type of WFP, it's really involved everybody else, the FAO, IFAD, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm keen to take some more questions. Who has the next question, please? We do have time for a number of other questions. I'm happy to take some. Happy to take the next question. Yes, please. There's a microphone on its way.
I just wanted to ask about the skill set of farming, and one of two mentions there about the potential loss of it and the idea of it being retained as a skill set in the UAE. Here, I think it's also of note, and as societies urbanize, my own country, Ireland, you know, everybody used to know how to grow a farm in the garden. Now, 50 years later, nobody knows how to grow a tomato in their garden, and yet they spend X dollars every day maybe on water and grassing their garden. How significant a setback is the loss of farming skills, and how important is the retention of them in the combat of food security, independence, sustainability in a country like the UAE, where skills to grow stuff here must be pretty important to preserve? So that's a question of Jeffrey, Dr.
Jeff.
Sure. As Richard mentioned earlier, one of the challenges we have is to make farming sexy, right? Is to tell people, don't go into the cities, stay on the farm, and we will give you the training you need to be prosperous. Yeah, you know, farming was always viewed as the worst job to have. It was dirty, it was hard work, it didn't pay, it didn't rain too much. So what we need to do is to empower the young generation and say, listen, we're going to teach you how to manage this land, how to do this. What's very interesting in developing countries, you have two types of farming. You have the mega industrialized farms, which is very successful in places like South Africa, where they're farming 100,000 hectares with combines that are being run off of GPS satellites. I was recently in Argentina, and I saw these $32 million combines. Right. This is an amazing piece of equipment that ran 24 hours a day in these wheat fields in Argentina, and they were all driven off GPS satellites. And what would happen is every 6 hours, a pickup truck would run beside the combine. It wouldn't stop, and some guy would jump out of the back and get in. Another guy would jump out of the combine and get in the pickup truck, and that was a shift change. And I said, well, why don't he just stop and get off? No. If we stop, then we lose X amount of production. And And then a little while later, a fuel truck came up and matched the pace of the combine and refueled it. And then it pulled away. So these combines were going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. As an operator sitting there to push some buttons every now and then, but rarely he did very little because it was driven off, a satellite feed that they were coming in. It was that level of mechanization. And then you get some poor woman out behind her hut with a hoe, digging, a small trench, maybe to grow some beans or peas or cassava or whatnot. Barely enough to feed her family, usually not, but then they still have to go to the market and trade something, So you've got this hand-to-mouth farming, and then you've got super high-tech space-age farming. It's that middle bit that we're striving for. We're saying, okay, you can grow tilapia in Lake Victoria in Uganda very successfully. We've demonstrated that. You can do that on Lake Kariba in Zimbabwe. You can, and tilapia is one of the best sources of white protein available, especially as we look at the decline in saltwater fish that's happening all around us through overfishing. But if you can't figure out how to get that fish processed and in a truck into the coast so it can get to the market and wind up at Spinney's or wind up at Waitrose or wherever it needs to go for the ultimate consumer who's going to pay that, then all you've got is a bunch of rotting fish. So it's the whole supply chain that you got to teach farmers, how to grow it better, how to process it, how to store it, how to ship it, how to package it, how to market it. We were working on a project the other day, which got me in trouble with the legal department, because a chicken project in Mozambique, Frango King, which is the direct competitor to Colonel Sanders and KFC, but nobody really knew what it was about. So I had suggested we would do a Master Chef Mozambique. And we would invite 20 of the best chefs in Mozambique. They'd come into the capital city and would film it live on TV. And we'd give them a car for the winner. But you'd have a cooking contest of your favorite chicken recipe. And they would bring in some celebrity football players and other personalities. And they would sample the dishes and the award would get it. And everybody thought it was a great idea until I got a letter from a lawyer in Australia saying, well, by the way, Master Chef is ours, and if you want to use it, So I said, okay, we'll call it Chef Masters. They said, no, that doesn't work either. But the whole idea that here is a country that has a wonderful growing export business in poultry, and chicken is the other white protein, but there was very little consumption in the country itself because it just traditionally didn't eat it. In Zimbabwe, they eat lots of chicken, they don't eat fish. In Mozambique, they eat fish, they don't eat a lot of chicken. So we're trying to figure out how do you link the two together. So not only do you have the trade going into Abu Dhabi, or the trade going into London, or the trade going into Beijing, more importantly, you have the trade going next door. Because that is a tremendous markets that are just incredibly inefficient. But what we have to do is for people like Sean and myself, or the doctor, is that as children, our parents beat into our heads, study hard, get a good education, all right, get a white-collar job, you'll do better than we have to do. I think what we got to do now is saying, you know what, if you want to be on the right side of history and the right side of the future, you want to be the person on the land growing the food for those of us who aren't smart enough to do it.
Thank you. I'm going to break with convention and ask a question to somebody in the audience. Mazen, we heard from you earlier on, economic advisor to His Excellency Fouad Siniora. Lebanon is not an arid desert country, quite the opposite. It has a cool Mediterranean climate. I remember enjoying very much a trip down the Bekaa Valley doing wine tasting and still enjoy a nice bottle of Lebanese wine every now and then here in Dubai. What experience can we learn from Lebanon and the Levant and those areas about the role that agriculture can play? Some of the things that have gone well and perhaps some of the bottlenecks that still remain or have been overcome.
Unfortunately, Lebanon is more an example of lost opportunities than gained ones. Because, as you said, we have the climate, we have the land, we have the water resources. But unfortunately, we never had the wise planning. We never have a top-bottom approach to fix many of the problems, like land fragmentation, the high cost of labor, which is of course determined by the fact that we do very well in services, and as a result, the labor cost is very high. And of course, you have the usual problems of security issues, and as you know, agriculture probably like production, you need safety and stability and a long horizon for big investors to come in and be there for a long time. But I think now, hopefully, with the next administration, more and more attention will be given to this. There is certain, as you said, there are certain sectors that have been very basically promising, which are the high value added food industry. You mentioned wine, for example, as one of them. Others can be specific type of flours, or this is not necessarily food safety when you're doing wine and flowers. But I fully agree with the miss on the panel that we look at food safety is not just an issue of producing your own food, but having a very vibrant export industry or tourism industry or foreign direct investments that allow you to generate enough foreign exchange in order to go and buy the food on the international markets.
Thank you very much indeed. We're short of time, but we are going to have time for a couple more questions, which I'm very, very happy to take. Yes, please. Yes, sir. The gentleman towards the center there. A microphone is coming to you. Again, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Joselito from Nestle Middle East. I'm just fascinated about the aquaculture that Dr. Deborah is talking about, which can be done in UAE, because UAE, as we all know, they have a history of good fishing skills. How do they embrace the culture of aquaculture as a technology, and how do you see the technicalities of sustainability of aquaculture as you introduce this to UAE?
There are, how many projects are there? There's a few all over the place, actually. The ones I know of are being driven by private sector investors, and they are sourcing the input technology from around the world. There is one organization that is bringing in the technology for shellfish farming, and they're talking to New Zealanders for this technology. Given that these are profit-oriented enterprises, and given that they have to pay for the production inputs here, there's almost a self-policing mechanism built in that tries to ensure some degree of sensible water use, for example, or sensible farming methods. And also because, and I'm only talking about the projects that I know of here, because they are looking at these with a view to expanding them across the GCC into other countries, and they're looking across the long time frame, this also ensures a degree of sustainability. It's not a 2-year project or a 5-year project to achieve rapid short-term output maximization. The aquaponics plant is, again, very small scale, but bringing in the expertise from around the world. And one person I spoke to has expressed the ambition to make Abu Dhabi a regional hub for using things like aquaculture and aquaponics for production. That this Abu Dhabi could be the place to come to learn how to do it. And so they're agglomerating the world's best practice here, and it will get sent out to the rest of the GCC from here. So again, that you would like to think that this would encourage users of the technology to do so with a view to sustainability and sensible resource usage. Have I answered your question? Not really? Sorry.
Believe it or not, UAE is going to be a major exporter of caviar very soon.
Well, we look forward to that day. I shall wash it down with some Lebanese wine. Listen, we're going to have to wrap up there. Thank you very much indeed to our panelists. First of all, His Excellency Yacoob Omar, Ambassador to the Republic of South Africa; Jeffrey Culpepper, Chairman of AgriSecura; Dr. Deborah Schlichting, Senior Economist at Solvus Economics; and also Avrash Hamouda, Head of Partnerships and Business Development for the Middle East and North Africa at the United Nations World Food Programme. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And with that, Diala, I shall hand it back to you.
Yeah, I just want to take this opportunity to close the forum this morning. And thank you, Richard, for your generous time and participation, and to also thank our featured guests today, the panel, and preceded by Sir Bob Geldof, His Excellency Sheikh Nahyan, and the former Prime Minister of Lebanon. I thought a very insightful speech on, in some ways, bringing home the reality of the aspects of the Arab Spring, that when things go out of balance on the very primitive level in food, and right back to the simple but tragic example of the food cart seller on the streets of a remote village in Tunisia who said finally he had enough and sparked a storm. So I think it's quite an insightful little story to take away. But I'd like to thank Mazen on behalf of the Prime Minister for coming today and bringing us that speech. And I'd like to thank all of you, and those of you who have already left and those of you who have remained, and the students. I hope you got some value out of it. I'd like to take a little indulgence and thank my father for being here, which is a rare pleasure for me to have my 20-year career, have him participate or witness one of the things that we do. So in that, I thank you, Dad, for your guidance and wisdom. So thank you all. We're going to retire on the way out for a coffee and a snack, and hopefully we'll see you all again next year.